VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is situation in Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedures, I now invite Mr. Nickolay Mladenov, Special Coordinator for Middle East Peace Process and personal representative of the Secretary General, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Secretary Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Nickolay Mladenov, the Special Coordinator for MEPP. Nickolay, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Security Council, I address you today following the agreement that was reached between Israel and the United Arab Emirates that stops Israeli annexation plans over parts of the occupied West Bank and includes the normalization of relations between the two countries. The Secretary General has welcomed this agreement, hoping it will create an opportunity for Israeli and Palestinian leaders to re-engage. Israel's commitment to suspending annexation removes an immediate threat that had the potential to upend the peace process and regional stability. The Secretary General has consistently called for Israel to abandon these plans. Annexation would constitute the most serious violation of international law, effectively close the door to a renewal of negotiations, and destroy the prospect of a viable Palestinian state and the two-state solution itself. The Israeli-UAE deal also has the potential to change dynamics across the region. It creates new opportunities for cooperation at a time when the Middle East and the world face grave dangers from COVID-19 pandemic and radicalization. It will create economic opportunities and opportunities for peace. I hope it will inspire leaders on all sides to re-engage constructively in meaningful negotiations to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The terms of reference of resolving the conflict have not changed. They are based on the relevant UN resolutions, bilateral agreements, and international law. Only a two-state solution in which Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace, security, and mutual recognition can lead to sustainable peace. Today is not the time to despair about the Palestinian cause. Annexation plans have been stopped. In fact, today is the time to redouble efforts, to reach out more actively than ever to leaders in the Middle East, and for the Palestinian and the Israeli leadership to re-engage constructively. Mr. President, regrettably, we continue to confront a series of multi-layered challenges on the ground as the resurgence of the COVID-19 pandemic in the occupied Palestinian territory and in Israel continue to be a major concern. The United Nations and its partners have continued to support Palestinians in responding to the pandemic, including by addressing critical gaps in medical supplies and equipment. Meanwhile, the Palestinian economy is in freefall. Now that the imminent threat of annexation has been removed, I hope that the Palestinian leadership will resume accepting the clearance revenues and provide some breathing space for the battered economy. Recently, the security situation in Gaza has also deteriorated, a trend which soon may become irreversible. It is essential that the ceasefire agreements brokered by Egypt and the United Nations, which have proved effective since August 2018, be reaffirmed. Mediation efforts will continue. However, I am concerned that militant activity, especially incendiary balloons, rockets, and a deteriorating humanitarian situation inside the Strip, are rapidly eroding existing arrangements. During the past months, Gaza's economy has deteriorated dramatically, compounding the impact of continued closures, intra-Palestinian division, and more than a decade of Hamas rule. COVID-19 related restrictions have halted the crossing of workers and traders into Israel and inhibited revenue transfers to Gaza's exporters. The current absence of cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and Israel has also slowed implementation of critical infrastructure projects, and jobs have been lost. UNSCO continues to work with the UN country team, with donors, and with the parties to address the needs in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. On the 28th of July, the United Nations country team released its COVID-19 Development System Response Plan, outlining critical interventions that the UN will implement in the coming 12 to 18 months in support of the Palestinian government. I encourage Member States to support these efforts. Mr. President, the UN is deeply engaged in efforts to mitigate the economic and humanitarian consequences of the PA's decision to halt all coordination with Israel in response to the threat of annexation. As reported last month, the UN reached agreements with the Palestinian government to facilitate vital deliveries of humanitarian aid and related equipment. Agreements were also reached with Israel to streamline its administrative procedures for these imports in light of the COVID-19 crisis. I am pleased also to report that coordination between the UN and all sides on the importation of humanitarian supplies is proceeding well. But coordination levels between Israel and the PA remain far below normal. This has impacted the delivery of assistance as well as the provision of services to the Palestinian population. Fortunately, after minor delays, a mechanism that supports the transfer of patients requiring medical treatment outside of Gaza has also been established. Let me reiterate that any increased responsibilities for the UN should be limited and time-bound and not designed to replace the roles and responsibility of the Palestinian Authority or of the government of Israel. I remain very concerned that the suspension of coordination and in particular revenue transfers cannot be sustained for much longer without severe humanitarian and economic consequences. Mr. President, as I noted earlier, tensions in Gaza are rising again. Over the reporting period, militants fired some 20 rockets towards Israel and launched some 270 balloons carrying incendiary devices, causing hundreds of fires and forcing some civilians to be evacuated from their homes. Shrapnel from rockets intercepted by the Iron Dome damaged a car and 2 houses in the Israeli town of Sderot. 6 civilians were lightly injured while running for shelter. Israeli defense forces responded by striking Hamas targets and agricultural fields, firing some 80 missiles and shells, with 5 people reportedly injured, including 4 children and 1 woman. Following one of these strikes, an unexploded Israeli missile was found in an UNRWA school in the Ash-Shati refugee camp. The IDF has classified this as an accident which is under review. I reiterate that the indiscriminate launching of rockets and incendiary devices towards Israeli population centers violates international law and must cease immediately. Likewise, children in schools should never be targeted by any party, nor should children be exposed to violence. In response to the sharp rise in the number of incendiary balloons, on the 11th of August, Israel limited the transfer of some goods and halted the transfer of construction materials through the Kerem Shalom crossing into Gaza. On the 12th of August, Israeli authorities stopped all fuel deliveries until further notice, including donor-funded fuel. As a result, the Gaza power plant has shut down, sharply reducing electricity provision to 3 hours per day. This is severely impacting critical infrastructure, including sewage treatment and the provision of clean drinking water. It is also affecting health facilities, schools, and conditions of some of the quarantine centers that are critical to the efforts to prevent an outbreak of COVID-19 in the Strip, particularly concerning reports given yesterday of the first identified cases of the coronavirus outside of quarantine centers in Gaza. Additionally, on the 16th of August, Israel closed the Gaza fishing zone completely. Yesterday, after hearing the news of the new cases that have been discovered in Gaza, we have asked the Israeli government to reinstate the delivery of Qatari-funded fuel for Gaza as an important humanitarian gesture in order to help alleviate the situation and deal with the crisis that is now unfolding. Mr. President, this latest escalation has once again demonstrated the urgency of implementing long-term solutions for Gaza. The Israeli population in proximity to the Strip live in constant fear, watching their lands burn and their children run for shelter. The Palestinian people in Gaza endure unbearable economic conditions, no freedom of movement, and political isolation. Closures and rounds of escalation have defined their lives for over a decade. There is a moral imperative to end all militant activity in Gaza, restore Palestinian national unity, and lift Israeli closures. But the political solutions that must be provided by leaders are nowhere in sight. Instead, we have a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year patchwork of crucial humanitarian efforts to prevent war and to try and sustain the lives of 2 million desperate Palestinians in Gaza. Mr. President, turning to the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, 3 Palestinians, including 1 child and 1 woman, were killed and 47 injured, including 2 children and 1 woman, in clashes, attacks, search and arrest operations, and other incidents. 7 Israelis, including 2 soldiers and 1 child, were injured during the reporting period. In one tragic incident, a 23-year-old Palestinian woman was killed by live fire in her home in Jenin during an ISF operation and ensuing clashes with local Palestinian residents. There are contradictory claims over responsibility for the shooting, with the ISF and local residents denying the use of live ammunition. On the 13th of August, Israel's prosecution authorities filed an indictment against 5 border police officers on 14 counts of serious abuse, including assault and robbery. A video subsequently released showed unacceptable, vicious beatings and humiliation of Palestinian detainees. On the 16th of August, an 18-year-old Palestinian was shot and injured by the ISF while reportedly attempting to throw a Molotov cocktail at Rachel's tomb near Bethlehem. The following day, another Palestinian man was shot and killed in Jerusalem's Old City while carrying out a stabbing attack against an Israeli border police officer who was moderately injured. In another unfortunate incident, involving a disabled person on the 17th of August, the ISF shot and injured a 60-year-old Palestinian man with hearing and speech impediments at the Kalandia checkpoint when he did not respond to their calls to halt. On the 20th of August, a 16-year-old Palestinian boy died after reportedly being shot by the ISF near the village of Deir Abu Mashal, west of Ramallah. 2 other Palestinians were reportedly injured. The ISF stated that the 3 were preparing to throw Molotov cocktails and set alight tires to attack passing vehicles. I reiterate that lethal force should be used only as a last resort against an imminent threat of death or serious injury and in accordance with the principle of proportionality. I call on the Israeli authorities to investigate these incidents. Amid the COVID-19 crisis, there has been a concerning increase in violent crime within Palestinian communities across the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem, as well as violent incidents involving Palestinian security forces and civilians, with several people shot dead in recent weeks. Palestinian organizations, meanwhile, focused on gender-based violence in the West Bank, have also reported a sharp increase in femicides. I urge Palestinian authorities, in line with their obligations, to enhance the protection of women and girls from GBV. Meanwhile, settlers perpetrated 20 attacks against Palestinians, resulting in 4 injuries and damages to property. On the 12th of August, settlers attacked Israeli security forces during an operation to demolish structures at an outpost near the settlement of Yitzhar. Palestinians carried out 27 attacks against Israeli settlers and other civilians in the West Bank, resulting in 5 injuries and some property damage. Mr. President, during the reporting period, Israeli authorities demolished 72 Palestinian-owned structures in Area C and East Jerusalem, displacing some 89 people, including 32 women and 40 children, and affecting 20 others. In addition, 11 Palestinians self-demolished their structures to avoid additional fines. On the 10th of August, Israel's High Court of Justice overturned an order to punitively demolish the home of a Palestinian accused of killing an Israeli soldier in May of 2020. The court emphasized that the rights of the perpetrator's wife and children would be disproportionately harmed if the demolition were to proceed. Mr. President, briefly turning to the region, in Lebanon, over 180 people are dead following the explosion in Beirut port on the 4th of August, with 30 persons still missing and several thousand injured. Almost 300,000 people are in need of shelter. A Lebanese investigation into the explosion is ongoing with the assistance of experts from France, Russia, Turkey, and the United States. Following the 9th of August International Donors Conference, co-convened by France and the United Nations, at which nearly 300 million in aid was pledged, a UN flash appeal launched on the 14th of August. The flash appeal raised another 565 million to help address humanitarian and recovery needs. Popular protests continued, while informal consultations on the formation of a new government are ongoing following the resignation of Prime Minister Hassan Diab's government on August the 10th. At the same time, the COVID-19 outbreak has worsened, prompting a nationwide lockdown in Lebanon. On the 18th of August, the Special Tribunal delivered its verdict in the Ayash et al. Case concerning the 2005 attack that killed former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri and 21 others, convicting Ayash while acquitting the 3 other defendants for lack of evidence. While the situation in the UNIFIL area of operations remained generally stable, tensions have been observed along the Blue Line, including a breach of the cessation of hostilities on the 27th of July. UNIFIL continues to maintain stability and diffuse tensions, including through its liaison and coordination efforts with the parties. On the Golan, tensions between Israel and Syria heightened on the 2nd and 3rd of August. On the 2nd of August, the Israeli Defense Forces carried out a strike killing 4 individuals from the Bravo side in the vicinity of the ceasefire line. The IDF informed UNDOF that they had carried out an attack on targets east of the Israeli technical fence to thwart an attempt to place explosives in that area. The following day, at the request of Syrian authorities, UNDOF facilitated the retrieval by the ICRC Syria of the remains of 4 individuals that were killed. The IDF, on the 3rd of August, also fired missiles from a helicopter across the ceasefire line onto the Bravo side, informing UNDOF that it had struck Syrian armed forces targets in response to an attempted IED attack the night before. UNDOF continues to engage with both parties to prevent an escalation of the situation and to remind them of their obligations to respect the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement. Mr. President, in closing, let me urge that we not lose sight of the deteriorating dynamics on the ground. Gaza is teetering on the brink of another major escalation with Israel. The occupied West Bank is fracturing under a multitude of economic and political pressures. Settlement expansion and demolitions continue, and the COVID-19 pandemic continues to have a devastating impact on Palestinian and Israeli societies. This is the stark reality of the current situation. Without resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, regional peace will not be complete. The legitimate national aspiration of 5 million Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, cannot be ignored. It is well beyond time that we all work together with the parties for peace before it is too late. That is why every opening must be explored, every opportunity must be used, every idea must be discussed and debated if we are to get out of the cycle of statements, preventive diplomacy, and conflict management, and work towards a real solution that is sustainable and is in line with relevant UN resolutions. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mladenov for his briefing. Now I would like to give the floor to the Council members to give their statement. I will start by giving the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States. Ambassador Kelly, you have the floor.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Mr. Mladenov, for your briefing. As always, we appreciate you and your team's impartiality as you work to address this conflict. It is not often that I have the opportunity to discuss genuinely good news during these meetings, and I have the pleasure to do that today. As many of you know, on August 13th, Trump announced the Abraham Accords, the most significant step toward peace in the Middle East in over 25 years. This historic agreement to normalize relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates advances peace in the Middle East. It is a testament to bold diplomacy and the courage of the United Arab Emirates and Israel to chart a new path that will unlock great potential of the region. The leadership and foresight of President Trump, as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, made this momentous achievement possible. Opening direct ties between two of the Middle East's most dynamic societies and advanced economies will transform the region by spurring economic growth, enhancing technological innovation, and forging closer people-to-people relations. Direct military cooperation will benefit the entire region by countering the threat posed by Iran's destabilizing activities in the Middle East and beyond. For years and up to today, Iran has defied international law by breaking the UN's own weapons ban, providing militias and terror groups with the firepower to kill and maim men, women, and children across the Middle East. While members of the Council are so far unwilling to confront this daily threat to peace and security, the United States stands by the Arab world and Israel as we work to maintain an arms embargo on the murderous Iranian regime. We believe that more Arab and Muslim countries will follow the United Arab Emirates' lead and normalize relations with Israel. And as we convene here today, Secretary Pompeo is in the region to promote further efforts toward peace, including discussions with Israeli and Emirati leadership about building on this historic breakthrough. I know the Palestinian leadership has been vocally opposed to this agreement, arguing that it neglects Palestinian rights. But let me be clear, by no means is the intention of this agreement to ignore the Palestinian people. In fact, it is just the opposite. We hope that this courageous step by the Emiratis will give the Palestinian leadership positive momentum to re-engage in negotiations with Israel to end their conflict. So much progress on defining the parameters of a settlement has been achieved in years past, as Israeli and Palestinian negotiators compromise with one another in the pursuit of peace. The sides must continue in spirit of goodwill, which we have already yielded peace for millions of people in the Middle East. Arab nations making peace with Israel does not diminish the need for peace with the Palestinians. America wants to see peace between the Israeli and the Palestinian people. Trump administration's blueprint for peace is a testament of earnest concern. For too long, the approach toward Israel-Palestinian peace has been to repeat tired talking points promoting unrealistic and outdated ideas about a solution to the crisis. And there is, of course, outside tangible interference, such as Iran, which supplies weapons and financial support to the terrorist organization Hamas that rules the Gaza Strip. Other nations also play a role in perpetrating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These activities sap the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank for being able to properly care for the Palestinian people and damage the prospect of peace and future prosperity. The international community must use the recent positive events to break out of this cycle and demand actionable change in the region. The lives and futures of both Israelis and Palestinians depends on it. I believe that the Palestinian leadership owes it to their people to look forward instead of looking back. Change is often difficult. However, things are only going to continue moving forward, and we hope that other Arab states can build on this agreement between the UAE and Israel and support the Palestinians to do the same. In conclusion, Mr. President, I understand that many of our colleagues in the Council plan to raise the issue of the arms embargo on the Islamic Republic of Iran in their remarks today. If they do, I would strongly encourage all of them to explain to the Iranian people why they are empowering a regime that brutalizes them, the Iranian people, and crushes their freedoms and crushes their aspirations. Explain to their friends in the region why they are turning their backs on them and ignoring their well-founded concerns. Explain to the Israelis and Palestinians, the Yemenis, the Lebanese, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and all the citizens of the Middle East why they think it is a good idea to allow the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism to gain access to modern weapon systems. Explain why they want to empower Iran to strengthen Hezbollah, strengthen the Houthis, strengthen the Assad regime. Explain to their own citizens why they oppose council action in the form of a straightforward resolution to stop Iran from buying and selling weapons, an action that makes us all less safe. Explain to the world why they are lending support to Tehran to continue to sow violence and chaos across continents when Iran is clearly in violation of its commitments. I'd be interested to know, and I'm sure those listening today would be interested as well. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the distinguished representative of the United States for her statement. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia. Ambassador Kais, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Nickolay Mladenov, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, for his briefing and valuable efforts. The Security Council made it clear in its previous and various resolutions that the establishment by Israel of settlements in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under international law and a major obstacle to the achievement of just, lasting, and then comprehensive peace. The Security Council and the international community have further emphasized that no changes will be recognized to the 1967 lines, including with regard to Jerusalem, other than those agreed by the parties through negotiations. In line with this long-standing and firm common position, the international community strongly rejected over the last few months the Israeli illegal plans to annex parts of the Palestinian territory, reaffirming once again that there are no other alternatives to the two-state solution, which remains the only viable solution to put an end to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, based on the relevant UN resolution and internationally endorsed terms of reference and parameters. In this context, Tunisia calls upon the Security Council and the entire international community to remain actively engaged against the looming threat of annexation. We further underline the imperative to compel Israel, the occupying power, to abide by its obligation under international law and put an end to its illegal, long-lasting occupation of the Palestinian territory and aggressive policy and practices against the Palestinian people. The impunity enjoyed by Israel over the decades, despite serious violations of international law, constitutes one of the major reasons behind Israel's challenge to the international community and the universal legal system. Mr. President, Tunisia stressed the importance of providing international protection to the Palestinian people, lifting the unjust blockade imposed on Gaza, and ending all other forms of discrimination and collective punishment, and calls upon the international community to continue support the Palestinian Authority's effort to confront the growing economic, social, and humanitarian challenges as a result of the continued occupation of the heavy impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We highly value the efforts of the humanitarian community in support of the Palestinian Authority's response to the pandemic and stress the necessity of an enhanced international aid in this regard. We also call for larger mobilization to ensure the continuity of UNRWA's essential services to Palestinian refugees across all its fields of operation, hence preserving its important role as a stabilizing factor in the region. Mr. President, in closing, Tunisia reiterates its firm and principled support to the brotherly Palestinian people in struggle to regain its legitimate rights, establish its independent and sovereign state on its land within the border of June or 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital, and resolve all final status issue based on the international legality resolution, the two-state vision, and the Arab Peace Initiative. Tunisia also reaffirms that the real problem and major cause of all this long-lasting conflict which has kept the region under tension and instability is indeed occupation, which must be ended. In this connection, we stress that the Palestinian rights are not time-bound and that the Israeli action and measures affecting the legitimate rights of Palestinian people are null and void and with no international legal effect. It's widely shared that the situation on the ground is not sustainable anymore and that the negative trends must be reversed. We therefore underline the need for a collective, concerted action toward the re-engagement of the party in negotiation based on the internationally endorsed terms of reference and parameters. The Middle East Quartet must assume its part of responsibility in this regard. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of France. Anne, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le coordonnateur spécial pour le processus de paix, Nickolay Mladenov, pour son intervention, et je souhaite souligner 4 points. Tout d'abord, la France a salué l'annonce d'une normalisation des relations entre les Émirats arabes unis et Israël, qui sont 2 partenaires stratégiques pour nous. Dans un contexte régional dégradé, cette annonce montre que des dynamiques positives peuvent s'enclencher. La décision prise dans ce cadre par les autorités israéliennes de suspendre l'annexion de territoires palestiniens est une étape positive, mais il est impératif que ce projet soit définitivement et irrévocablement abandonné. Car ce projet constituerait non seulement une violation grave et flagrante du droit international, mais serait également un coup irréversible porté au processus de paix et à la solution des 2 États. À cet égard, la poursuite de la colonisation demeure un motif de préoccupation majeur pour la France. Il en est de même des démolitions d'habitations et de structures, ainsi que de la violence des colons contre les Palestiniens en zone C, comme à Jérusalem-Est, documenté dans un rapport récent du Bureau de coordination des affaires humanitaires des Nations Unies. Deuxièmement, je veux réitérer l'appel de la France à la reprise de négociations crédibles et ambitieuses entre Israéliens et Palestiniens. Une méthode pour parvenir à un règlement juste et durable du conflit, conforme au droit international, aux résolutions de ce Conseil et aux paramètres agréés. Ces paramètres sont connus. 2 États vivant en paix et en sécurité, le long de frontières sûres et reconnues, avec Jérusalem comme capitale des 2 États. Ce n'est pas un mantra, c'est le seul horizon qui permet de construire une paix durable et juste en répondant aux aspirations légitimes des 2 peuples. Cette paix, seuls les partis pourront la conclure, mais la France se tient prête à y contribuer aux côtés de ses partenaires européens, arabes et internationaux. Troisièmement, je veux exprimer la préoccupation de la France face au regain des tensions entre Gaza et Israël au cours des dernières semaines. Ces violences doivent cesser avant que ne s'enclenche un nouveau cycle de violences meurtrières. La France appelle à la poursuite des efforts visant à éviter toute escalade dont les premières victimes seraient les populations civiles, israéliennes et palestiniennes. Au-delà de cette situation sécuritaire critique, il est absolument crucial de répondre à la crise humanitaire qui ne peut passer qu'à travers la levée du blocus sur Gaza, assortie de garanties de sécurité crédibles pour Israël. Des progrès sont parallèlement indispensables dans la réconciliation interpalestinienne. Ce processus passe par la tenue des élections nationales. Quatrièmement, je veux dire combien l'augmentation du nombre de personnes touchées par la pandémie de Covid-19 en Cisjordanie, y compris à Jérusalem-Est, est inquiétante. La pandémie a également des conséquences économiques considérables pour la région. Le renforcement de la coopération entre tous les acteurs, autorités palestiniennes et Israël, Agence des Nations Unies, ONG et autres, est impératif. À cet égard, nous appelons les parties à mettre en œuvre cette coopération et à assurer l'acheminement de l'aide humanitaire conformément à leurs obligations respectives. La France prend part à l'effort de solidarité auquel ont appelé les Nations Unies et l'autorité palestinienne, notamment via l'action de l'Agence française de développement et nos contributions au plan global de réponse humanitaire face à la Covid-19. Je rappelle aussi l'importance de l'action de l'UNRWA au service des réfugiés palestiniens qui bénéficient du soutien indéfectible de la France, comme en atteste notre dernière contribution de 20 millions d'euros. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. I would like to now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam. Vietnam, Ambassador Cui, you have the floor.
Thank Mr. President, and I would like to thank Mr. Nickolay Mladenov, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, for his briefing. Mr. President, we remain deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza and other occupied Palestinian territories. The number of COVID-19 infections increased by approximately 40% in the first 2 weeks of August. The Palestinian healthcare system has been overstressed since the outbreak of the pandemic. The lack of freedom of movement of patients, medical equipment, and healthcare personnel has impeded the proper functioning of local healthcare service. The shortage of electricity has made the situation even worse. Last week, the only power plant in Gaza has to shut down after running out of fuel. In this context, we urgently call on the international community to step up support for UNRWA in order to provide humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. All parties should work closely with one another, coordinate with the international relief efforts to slow down the infection and control the spread of the COVID-19. Yet, this is not only the only concern. We are also alarmed by the escalation of tension in Gaza in the last month. Civilians, including women and children, continue to be killed. The tragedy in the past are likely to be repeated if this cycle of violence is not stopped before it is too late. Meanwhile, the West Bank's House of Palestinian people in the West Bank, the House of Palestinian people continue to be demolished. Attack by Israeli shelters continue to cause dozens of casualties and remain a major security concern. Therefore, we reiterate our call for all parties to refrain from acts of violence. We call on Israel to leave its closure of Gaza Strip as an initial step of goodwill to reduce the ongoing tension. We urge Israel to stop the expansion of settlement, stop demolition and seizure of Palestinian properties, and allow Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, to develop their community. These actions should be undertaken in line with obligations under international humanitarian law and relevant United Nations resolution, including Security Council Resolution 2334. Mr. President, Vietnam welcomes efforts contributing to enhancing regional peace, security, and stability, including those to promote dialogue and relations among countries in the region. We believe that a fair and sustainable solution to the Middle East peace process can only be achieved through peace talk and dialogue among the concerned parties on the basis of international law and relevant resolution of the United Nations. In this connection, we would like to reaffirm our solidarity and consistent support for the just struggles of the Palestinian people for their inalienable rights, as well as two-state solution for the establishment of an independent state of Palestine that coexists in peace with the State of Israel along the pre-1967 line and with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. Ambassador Ronda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Special Coordinator Mladenov for his briefing this morning. We meet again at a critical juncture. The Security Council must solemnly reaffirm our commitment to upholding the vital principles of international law. In particular, we must, by all appropriate means at our disposal, safeguard the territorial integrity of the State of Palestine and promote peaceful settlement of the decades-long dispute. Mr. President, we welcome the recent announcement by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to delay annexation activities in the occupied West Bank. Notwithstanding, we call on the Middle East Quartet to renew their efforts to help facilitate a peace agreement that is acceptable to both Israel and Palestine. it is a categorical imperative that the Quartet carefully examines and pursues all practical courses of action to lead the peace process to a successful conclusion. We are all aware that annexation undermines international norms and constitutes a serious breach of international law. A continuation of these activities across the West Bank violates the terms of Security Council Resolution 465, 476, 478, and 2334, as well as all relevant UN General Assembly resolutions. We therefore remain deeply concerned about the expansion of Israeli settlements and associated infrastructure in the occupied Palestinian territories, which have no legal validity and undermines the peace process. As such, we reiterate the demands of the Security Council Resolution 2334 that Israel immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and to fully respect all of its legal obligations in this regard. Turning to the humanitarian situation, the dire needs of Palestinians in occupied West Bank and Gaza demand urgent attention amidst the surge in COVID-19 cases. The Palestinians cannot combat the pandemic alone, and in this regard, we once again urge the international community to ensure that UNRWA has adequate, predictable, and sustainable financing to respond to the urgent humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people. We also echo UNRWA's appeals that aid to Palestinian refugees in Lebanon is built into the international community's immediate emergency response efforts and longer-term support plans following the horrific explosion in Beirut that claimed the lives of Palestinian refugees, among many others. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines reiterates its firm commitment to the two-state solution, and in this context also we reaffirm our long-held position that we will not recognize any changes to the 4th July 1967 lines, including with regard to Israel, other than those agreed by the parties through negotiations. Only through a negotiated two-state solution that addresses the needs and concerns of both Israel and Palestine can we achieve our long-term dream of peace in the Middle East. As Coordinator Mladenov says earlier today is the day to redouble our efforts to that end before it is too late. I thank you, Mr.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Niger. Niger, Ambassador Abari, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Niger has followed with great interest the latest developments in the region, including the declaration of August 13, which announced the resumption of relations between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. The agreement between the two countries promises, among other things, the establishment of diplomatic relations, the resumption of air links, the intensification of trade, cooperation in the military and health field, as well as the suspension by Israel of its project of annexation of territories in the West Bank. If a rapprochement between Israel and the Arab countries should contribute to the effort to ease tension and to the triumph of peace, it would undoubtedly be welcomed with great enthusiasm as a long-awaited sign of hope for the Middle East. In a decade, we have already witnessed so many announcements described as historic and strategic turning points without the expected positive effects. From Palestine to Syria, from Iraq to Afghanistan and Yemen, many countries and peoples are still facing the torments of violence, desolation, and despair. This observation should challenge us and encourage us to support every sign of hope on the road to peace, at the altar of which so many innocent lives have been sacrificed and in whose pursuit so many initiatives have failed. Thus, in the absence of an official abandonment by Israel of its plan to annex the territories in the West Bank, the prospect of relaunching the peace talks in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will unfortunately remain an illusion. Mr. President, my country remains convinced that in order to achieve this peace, which we have been seeking for nearly 70 years in the Middle East, the Palestinian cause cannot be circumvented. It stands out as a haunting reminder of the right of peoples to self-determination. The Palestinian question remains a priority that could not be subject to an agreement between Israel and another third state. The lasting treatment of this question necessarily requires talks between Israel and Palestine based on just and unanimously accepted basis, that is a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security in strict compliance with the 1967 borders. Now more than ever, it is time for us to give hope to these people so long exposed to the torment of instability and violence. The restraint shown by the Israeli authorities in not carrying out the threat of annexation, as well as the readiness expressed by the Palestinians to resume negotiations with Israel, are the sign of a new positive political momentum that the Security Council, the Middle East Quartet, and the international community must do everything possible to maintain, with a view to restarting the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks and thus give peace a chance. In this regard, we support the Secretary General's proposal for the creation of a platform among the countries of this region that will enable them, through peaceful means, to resolve any problems that may arise between them. Mr. President, in conclusion, my delegation would like to express its great concern at the increase in the number of cases of COVID-19 contamination in Israel and the Palestinian territories. While 2 months ago the exemplary cooperation between the two authorities made it possible to manage the crisis effectively, today an exacerbation of the pandemic could be particularly disastrous on both sides. It will certainly be more so in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza, where several factors such as poverty, food insecurity, overpopulation, and the precariousness of the health system, accentuated by an unacceptable embargo, contribute to making the populations even more vulnerable. In order to resolve this particularly worrisome situation, it is urgent that Israel, the occupying power, takes the effective measures required by international humanitarian law to ensure the well-being of the population in territories under its control. The international community must also support UNRWA's efforts on the ground because millions of needy people depend on its action. Niger salutes the tireless effort of Nickolay Mladenov and reaffirms its full commitment to support the effort of the international community for a rapid settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has a definite impact on peace, stability, and security in the entire Middle East. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci beaucoup, Niger. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic, Ambassador Jose. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Special Coordinator Mr. Mladenov for his briefing. At the outset, the Dominican Republic welcomes the agreement between the United States, United Arab Emirates, and Israel to, inter alia, halt the Israeli annexation of Palestinian lands. This move could create vast opportunities to bring peace in the Middle East through dialogue, cooperation, and stability. It should open new path for Israeli and Palestinian leaders to re-engage in meaningful negotiations. The Dominican Republic believes that this indeed significant diplomatic agreement needs to be a first step, perhaps a a door opener towards a broader process that includes all Palestinian concerns, including the long-standing two-state solution and in line with UN resolutions. We encourage parties to end any unilateral moves and provocation narratives in different forms that could obstruct the current peace prospects and violate mutual rights. We invite them to engage for the sake of common future. In peace and stability, a broader dialogue needs to follow this agreement, including the Palestinians, of course. Let us seize this opportunity. The Security Council must ensure that the Israeli-Palestine situation will be solved within the framework of the international agreed standards. We must convey a clear message of collective will to redirect the process towards a negotiated peace on the basis of recognition and respect of mutual rights, including self-determination and independence. These principles need to remain at the core of any political process. Mr. President, in this regard, we also recognize the importance of an intra-Palestinian reconciliation. This must be initiated to allow the necessary national consolidation to advance the legitimate aspiration of its people and ultimately lead to a process of political renewal based on free and inclusive elections. This is really a must to engage. We encourage the Palestinian leaders and the international community to concentrate all their efforts to strengthen national unity and support the election process. Mr. President, the Palestinian government is still very much in need of external support. The humanitarian situation of the population in the West Bank remains dire. We encourage donor countries to continue to support with their contribution to allow to meet the deep basic needs of the Palestinian population living under occupation. The devastating public health and humanitarian implication of the COVID-19 pandemic has delivered negative consequences on health, food security, and development of the country. This, coupled with widespread insecurity, electricity crisis, and lack of opportunities for young, is a great concern to the Dominican Republic. We therefore commend the indispensable work done on the ground by humanitarian organizations and UN agencies such as UNRWA, as well as the support of friendly countries to alleviate suffering and bring about change. Mr. President, reports of daily violence developing throughout the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continue. The Dominican Republic reiterates its condemnation of any act of violence and intimidation against civilian populated areas, including women and children, the excessive use of force, and reprimands the launch of rockets and incendiary devices indiscriminately. There's no justification for carrying out this indiscriminate attacks. There's no justification for carrying out these indiscriminate attacks. It is imperative that every effort is made to achieve a complete and definite de-escalation. We urge all parties to act with maximum restraint to ensure that the ceasefire is maintained and civilians are protected. Finally, we call for strengthening the international consensus of this conflict, relying on peaceful conflict resolution, international law, and multilateralism, and in the recognition of the important mediation role of the United Nations. We are hopeful that together, Israelis and Palestinians, with our help and support, are able to build the bridges in the vast spaces between them. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium, Ambassador Philippe. Vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I would like to thank the Special Coordinator, Mr. Nickolay Mladenov, for his briefing, and I thank him and his team for their relentless efforts. Mr. President, Belgium welcomes the recent announcement on the normalization of relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and we acknowledge the constructive role played by the United States of America in this regard. The announcement of the suspension of plans to formalize the annexation of parts of the Palestinian occupied territories certainly constitutes a step in the right direction. However, Belgium urges Israel to abandon these plans definitively. As we have stated before, any annexation, irrespective of its size and denomination, would constitute a grave breach of international law, including the United Nations Charter. We will therefore not recognize any changes to the 1967 borders other than those agreed upon by the parties. Annexation would undoubtedly have consequences for the security on the ground and also in the wider region. But most importantly, annexation would seriously undermine the viability of a two-state solution and close the door for future negotiations. The normalization of relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates will not only benefit both countries, it also constitutes an important building block for peace and stability in the wider region. There can be no peace in the Middle East without a permanent solution to the Palestinian question. We hope that the agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates will create opportunities for Israelis and Palestinians to re-engage. In this regard, we reiterate our call for intra-Palestinian reconciliation. We remain committed to a negotiated and viable two-state solution built upon the internationally agreed parameters and international law. All parties should come to the negotiation table without preconditions and resume meaningful negotiations. Belgium encourages all international and multilateral efforts aimed at a meaningful resumption of talks, provided they are fully in line with international law and the internationally agreed parameters, and also that they equally take into account the legitimate aspirations of both sides. We fully support the efforts of the Middle East Quartet, of which the European Union is a member. Mr. President, in the absence of a perspective on such a just and lasting peace, the humanitarian, socio-economic and security situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. We are deeply concerned about the recent violent incidents in Gaza and the West Bank. We condemn the terror attacks and violence from all sides. International human rights law and international humanitarian law, including the principles of necessity, distinction, and proportionality in the use of force, must be fully respected. We call for independent and thorough investigations into alleged violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Perpetrators of such acts must be held accountable. Following the firing of rockets and the launching of incendiary balloons from Gaza into Israel, the Israeli authorities have halted the entry of most goods to Gaza, including fuel, and prevented access to fishing areas along Gaza's coast. We call on both sides to de-escalate tensions and exercise maximum restraint. Belgium commends the efforts of the United Nations and of Egypt in this regard. These developments only further add to the hardship of the Palestinian people in Gaza. We call for the end of the closure and a full opening of the crossing points while addressing Israelis' legitimate security concerns. Against the backdrop of COVID-19, an impeded humanitarian access to Gaza is more than ever needed. And in this regard, I reiterate Belgium's unwavering support for UNRWA. Mr. President, to conclude, I would like to voice Belgium's concern regarding the impact of COVID-19 on the occupied Palestinian territory and in particular on children. We call on all sides to immediately and unconditionally release all Palestinian children from detention and to put a moratorium on new admissions of children into detention facilities. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa. You have the floor, Ambassador Jerry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Special Coordinator Mladenov for his useful and frank briefings on the current situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. South Africa has noted with concern developments of the past days in the occupied Palestinian territory, including Gaza Strip. In this regard, Mr. President, we support the Coordinator Mladenov and Secretary General's call for immediate cessation of hostilities. The current precarious situation prevailing in Gaza is of particular concern to South Africa. The almost daily attack on Gaza and the use of warplanes repeatedly in retaliation for launching of incendiary balloons is not a proportional response and will instead serve to inflame tension, endanger the lives of civilians, and further degrade critical infrastructure. Moreover, Israel blockade of Gaza must end. Israel blockade has had a devastating impact on Palestinians living in Gaza and their livelihoods. Israel's latest ban on allowing fuel into Gaza has resulted in a shutdown of Gaza's only power station, plunging Gaza into darkness and jeopardizing the lives of civilians dependent on an already strained health sector. These actions are inhumane and are causing serious bodily and mental harm to the people of Gaza, especially at the time when the world is in the grip of fighting a global pandemic. We call on Israel to respect and honor its obligation as an occupying power under the Fourth Geneva Convention to put an end to its disproportionate and hostile actions. Mr. President, the Palestinian people, especially those living in Gaza, cannot afford any more hurt, hardship, and hostilities. Therefore, we call for the release of all detainees and political prisoners, especially women and children and the elderly. All civilians are entitled to a fair and equal justice system. However, this is not the case for Palestinians living under illegal military occupation. In this regard, we have learned last week of yet another death of a Palestinian teenager who succumbed to his wounds in detention after being shot by Israeli soldiers near Ramallah. These brutal actions by Israel soldiers have to stop. Israel operates an unequal two-tiered legal system in where Israelis are subject to a civilian, criminal, and legal system, while Palestinians, including children, living in the same area are subject to a military law, making Israel the only country that applies military law to minors. Mr. President, as we and many others have said before, the solution to this decades-long conflict is a dialogue and negotiations culminating in a political agreement that sees an independent sovereign state of Palestine existing side by side in peace with secured Israel, as guided by UN resolutions, international law, and internationally agreed parameters. Any viable peace must include the full participation of all parties as equal partners. In this regard, any such initiative aimed at finding a solution to the conflict must take into account the needs and aspirations of Palestinian people. For too long, Mr. President, Palestinian most basic rights, needs, hope, and aspiration had been eroded and ignored. South Africa strongly believes that any peace plan should not allow Palestinian statehood to devolve into an entity devoid of sovereignty, territorial continuity, and economic viability. In this regard, a solution must be premised on a just settlement with just laws that is right-based and that facilitates equality and equity for all who have the right to live in territories of Israel and Palestine. This includes the sovereign equality between states. Mr. President, Zaiba reiterates its call for the full implementation of Resolution 2334 of 2016. The ongoing and illegal settlement construction, siege and demolition of Palestinian land and property must be addressed. The overt violation of Security Council resolutions usually evoke stricter countermeasures on the party responsible for the infringement. However, again and again, Palestine is deprived of its right to see the illegal action of Israeli occupation being brought to justice. Many of us have called for violations of international law to be held accountable for their action. Therefore, Israel must also be held accountable for its persistent violations of international law, including United Nations General Assembly and Security Council resolutions, including 2334. Mr. President, as we are discussing a broader Middle East situation, allow me to make few remarks on the matter of the JCPOA. The United States, of its own violation, unilateral withdrawal from JCPO on the 8th of May 2018, restating unilateral sanctions against Iran, which is a violation of JCPO and Resolution 2231. Having confirmed its withdrawal from the JCPOA, and by not participating in any of the JCPO structures or subsequent activities, the United States ceased to be a JCPO participant and is therefore ineligible to submit notification to the Council in terms of Resolution 2231. As Resolution 2331, the JCPO are inextricably linked and are mutually contingent. Any party that out of its own violation withdraw from JCPO cannot be regarded as a JCPO participant state, and thus will not be able to invoke provision of Resolution 2331 as participating state. In conclusion, Mr. President, the future of the Middle East hangs in the balance, and the current forms of aggression in Gaza could give way to further instability and violation in the region. The Middle East Peace Quartet must step up its activities now and save what is left of the two-state solution and reassures the Palestinians of their future in their own viable homeland based on the June 1967 borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Estonia. Mr. Gerd, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank Special Coordinator Mladenov for his briefing. During the past months, Estonia has repeatedly called for keeping the momentum alive for moving towards peace between Israel and Palestinian Authority. Hopefully, the recent development of announcing normalization of bilateral relations between Israel and the UAE will contribute to this end. Estonia welcomes this historical announcement and the role played by the United States in this respect. We believe the normalization of relations between Israel and the UAE will contribute also to the stability of the whole region. It is positive that along with this agreement, Israel is committing to suspend plans to unilaterally annex areas of the occupied Palestinian territory. We also join the UN Secretary General in his hope that this will create an opportunity for Israeli and Palestinian leaders to re-engage in meaningful negotiations. Estonia remains committed to a negotiated two-state solution based on internationally agreed parameters and relevant UN resolutions, taking into account the legitimate aspirations of both parties and Israeli security concerns. Only direct and meaningful negotiations between the parties can resolve the final status issues and achieve a just and lasting peace. As the outbreak of COVID-19 continues in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, a need for unity and solidarity is even more important, and we underline the continued importance of cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian authorities to tackle the pandemic. Estonia strongly calls upon all parties to refrain from any unilateral steps which could undermine the viability of the two-state solution and increase instability in this region. This includes Israel's settlement activity in the occupied Palestinian territories, including in East Jerusalem, which is illegal under international law. We call on the Palestinian Authority to reconsider its announcement of suspending agreements with Israel, including in the area of security. This would be especially vital in the context of COVID-19. We are deeply worried about the gradual increase of violence between Israel and Gaza after a relatively quiet summer. We condemn the firing of rockets from Gaza towards Israel or any other form of violence targeting civilian population. We call on both parties to exercise maximum restraint to avoid escalation of violence, as it would further undermine the prospects for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. We encourage all Palestinian factions to work towards reconciliation, which would enable them to address common challenges and the needs and expectations of the Palestinian population, and is essential in order to reach the two-state solution. We also encourage Palestinians to announce elections. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Estonia. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany. Mr. Günther, you have the floor.
Mr. President, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Nickolay Mladenov, for the briefing and the excellent work. I would like to make several points. The first one is on the normalization agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Israel and the United Arab Emirates have come to a truly historic decision by agreeing to normalize their relations. This is truly good news, as it is an important step towards peace in the region. We now trust that annexation plans are truly and indefinitely suspended, and that this will also include restraint with regard to ongoing settlement expansion or plans to build new settlements. We see with great concern the demolition of Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem. This is particularly worrisome against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. Confidence-building steps are now needed instead. We believe that a halt to demolition of residential structures in Area C of the West Bank, as well as East Jerusalem, as well as approving the construction of housing units for the Palestinian population in Area C, would send an encouraging signal in these times of hardship. We support Israel's effort to expand regional cooperation and advance normalization with other Gulf states. My second remark is on the agenda towards reviving the peace process. We should now use the momentum and the positive dynamics to revive the Middle East peace process and to restore a meaningful dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. We want to bring them back on a path towards a negotiated peaceful settlement. Again, with annexation being off the table, we encourage the Palestinian side to re-engage and present their proposals in more depth. Germany remains convinced that a negotiated two-state solution based on international law, the relevant UN resolutions, and the internationally agreed parameters is the only viable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We keep repeating this message because it reflects our strong conviction and firm commitment to the rules-based international order, to the security of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and to the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and statehood. I would like to propose 4 elements on how we can work together in order to seize the current momentum for reviving the peace process. First, we need to find ways to resume direct negotiations between the parties. We continue to believe that reactivating the Middle East Quartet would be the best option to discuss the way forward. We reiterate our full support to the efforts of Special Coordinator Nickolay Mladenov in this regard. Together with our European and Arab partners in the so-called Munich format, we stand ready to assist and offer our support in facilitating a path back to dialogue. Second, we call on Israel to end the expansion of settlements. Israeli settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territories are illegal under international law. They severely undermine the prospects for a two-state solution by eroding the possibility of establishing a contiguous, independent and sovereign Palestinian state. Third, we call on both sides to fully implement Resolution 2334 with regard to settlement activities, as well as all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terrorism, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. In this context, we reiterate Germany's condemnation of all attacks and threats against Israel by Hamas and other terrorist groups, such as the recent rocket attacks and attacks via incendiary balloons. Fourth, we must keep stressing that the Intra-Palestinian Reconciliation also remains key for achieving a negotiated two-state solution. Gaza and the occupied West Bank must be reunited under a single government, the democratic legitimacy of Palestinian institutions renewed, and governance and responsiveness to the needs of the Palestinian population must be strengthened. Allow me a remark on COVID-19 in Israel and the Palestine territory. We are concerned about the state of the COVID-19 pandemic in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. We are convinced that particularly now, in this time of crisis, we need more willingness to cooperate on both sides. We call on both parties to resume their coordination and cooperation in the fight against COVID-19. In this context, we commend the UN and its agencies, in particular UNRWA, for their efforts to respond to the humanitarian implications of the COVID-19 pandemic in the occupied Palestinian territories. I would like to say a word on the latest tensions in Gaza. We are concerned about latest tensions in Gaza and southern Israel, and we welcome the mediation efforts by Egypt and the United Nations. It goes without saying that we condemn the attacks against Israeli civilians from Gaza. At the same time, the humanitarian situation in Gaza needs to be urgently improved. What we need now is prudence from all parties and willingness to de-escalate. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Germany. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Ambassador Vasily, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Nickolay Mladenov for his briefing. The Palestinian problem has a regional dimension, as reflected in the Arab Peace Initiative endorsed by the world community. Without its settlement, as history proves, it is impossible to establish peace in the region. Settlement that is acceptable to both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, is the only guarantee of a lasting peace. At all stages of work on the Middle East peace process, Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council and a member of the International Quartet of Mediators, has always proceeded from the need to achieve a comprehensive settlement on the basis of the internationally recognized legal framework approved by the United Nations. It includes UN resolutions, the Arab Peace Initiative, and the fundamental principle of two-state solution. This base provides for the creation of an independent, sovereign, and territorially contiguous Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with the capital in East Jerusalem, which would live in peace with Israel. And Russia will adhere to these principles. The entire range of final status issues should be resolved in direct negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. These negotiations should be launched as soon as possible. We call on our partners in the Quartet, the UN, the EU, and the US, to intensify efforts to assist the parties. We are ready for a dialogue with key regional players. In addition, Russia is actively engaged with various Palestinian representatives in the interests of overcoming their differences, helping our Egyptian friends in this regard. We reaffirm the call to abstain from provocative moves and unilateral steps. International cooperation and joint action must accompany the advancement of the Middle East peace process. In this regard, we took note of the trilateral statement of the leaders of the United States, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. In accordance with this document, Israel will suspend the annexation of the occupied West Bank and the Jordan River. We consider this important since such plans were a key obstacle to the resumption of Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. Annexation would destroy the prospects for a viable, independent, and territorially contiguous Palestinian state. The aforementioned trilateral statement also confirms that the parties will continue their efforts to achieve a just and sustainable settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In this regard, we would like to remind that despite the existence of unilateral initiatives, the basis of such settlement should remain the internationally recognized parameters. We emphasize that unilateral actions, including plans for annexation, which undermine the legal basis for a settlement, should be abandoned. Looking at the situation on the ground, we call on all parties to refrain from violence, including threats of rocket launches on Israeli territory, and on Israel to stop its settlement activity, the demolition of Palestinian property, and evictions. We are concerned with recent escalation around Gaza. The coronavirus multiplied problems of local population. We call on the parties concerned to cooperate and fight the pandemic together. We share concerns about the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. We are also concerned about the increased workload of UNRWA, as well as the need for additional funding for the agency to respond to new challenges, including in countries hosting Palestinian refugees, primarily in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. We call on the international community to respond and support UNRWA. Mr. President, in conclusion, we would like to raise another important issue directly related to the situation in the Middle East. It has clear implications for the regional and international peace and security. We all know that our US colleagues on August 20 handed to the President of the Council a letter with a claim that US allegedly triggers a snapback process as foreseen by the OP11 of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Almost all Council members responded immediately by their letters to the President. As far as we can judge, in these letters, an overwhelming majority of the member states explicitly stated that the letter from the United States can't be considered as a notification as per paragraph 11 of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Nor does it trigger the snapback procedure, since the US has ceased its participation in the Jcpoa. The United States is the only member of the Security Council that claims the opposite. We therefore would like to ask you a question, Mr. President. Could you inform us about the results of your bilateral consultations with member states of the Security Council that you held after receiving a US letter, as well as to clarify what is your view of the US claim and how are you going to proceed in this situation? In particular, Mr. President, do you intend to follow the procedures foreseen by OP11 of the Security Council Resolution 2231? I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Many thanks, Mr. President, and thanks also to Special Coordinator Mladenov for his briefing. Mr. President, as others have done, I would like to first say a few words about Lebanon. The devastating explosion in Beirut has caused enormous suffering and damage, as Mr. Mladenov also set out. Our sympathies go out to all those who have been affected by this tragedy and who have lost loved ones. The UK stands with the Lebanese people in this hour of need. Our £25 million package of humanitarian support, as well as our technical experts who deployed within days of the explosion, will help to address some of the critical needs of the most vulnerable in Lebanon. And the deployment of HMS Enterprise, one of our naval ships, on the 10th of August also complements these efforts. Our support to the Lebanese army in their efforts to respond to the disaster is also critical. Turning to the topic of today's discussion, Mr. President, I would like to start by welcoming the announcement on the 13th of August, as set out by Ambassador Kelly, of the normalization of relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and in particular, the suspension of Israel's plans to annex parts of the West Bank. As my Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have said, this is an historic step which sees the normalization of relations between two great friends of the United Kingdom. The UK has consistently made clear in this Council our firm opposition to annexation, which would have been contrary to international law, counterproductive to securing peace in the region, and a severe blow to the prospects of the two-state solution. We therefore profoundly hope that this moment can be used as a step towards direct talks between Israel and Palestinians, as there can be no substitute for direct talks in order to reach a two-state solution and a lasting peace. My Foreign Secretary is in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories today, encouraging both leaders to push forward on this momentum of this announcement. The UK stands ready to support this endeavour. Mr. President, despite this positive development, we are concerned by other negative trends on the ground. The number of COVID-19 cases continues to rise across the region. Meanwhile, Hamas has been launching IEDs and firing rockets into Israel. Such actions by Hamas are unacceptable, and we call on them to cease immediately. The current situation continues to have a devastating impact on the people living in Gaza in particular. As ever, dialogue can be the only way to address the situation. We call on Israel to lift movement and access restrictions and allow fuel to enter Gaza, which is vital to power hospitals, water, and sewage treatment. More broadly, we encourage the Palestinian Authority and the Government of Israel to urgently resume cooperation across all files, security, economic, and civil, at this critical time. While the shadow of annexation appears to be lifted, we remain concerned at the potential for further settlement advancements, continued demolitions and evictions. Mr. President, we are also concerned by continued acts of violence, and we're alarmed to hear of the shooting on the 17th of August at Kalandia checkpoint of a Palestinian who was unarmed and deaf. The use of lethal force should only be deployed as a last resort. I would like to finish by reiterating the UK's long-standing position on the Middle East peace process. We support a negotiated settlement leading to a safe and secure Israel living alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with agreed land swaps, Jerusalem as the shared capital of both states, and a just, fair, agreed and realistic settlement for refugees. The United Kingdom remains committed to supporting such efforts towards peace in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of China. Ambassador Jun, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I also wish to thank Special Coordinator Mladenov for the briefing and also for the relentless efforts he and his team has made in promoting peace and security in the Middle East. The issue of Middle East, in particular the Palestinian question, has been on the agenda of the Security Council for so many years. The international community has put tremendous attention and energy on this specific issue. As a reliable friend of the Palestinian people, China has been making relentless and constructive efforts in promoting a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement of the Palestinian question. President Xi Jinping has put forth a 4-point proposal on this question. As the Special Coordinator has pointed out just now, we are witnessing growing tensions between Palestine and Israel, which have put the peace process in jeopardy and heightened the risk of regional conflicts. To be frank, we have more negative news instead of positive ones. Under such circumstances, the international community must step up its efforts on the Palestinian question and push forward the Middle East peace process with a sense of urgency. The international community should firmly promote peaceful settlement based on the two-state solution. Independent statehood is the inalienable national right of the Palestinian people, and it cannot be compromised or bargained away. We hope that relevant parties will take concrete actions to advance the political process and pave the way for early resumption of peace talks between Palestine and Israel on an equal footing. Relevant UN resolutions, the Land for Peace principle, and the two-state solution set out the overall direction of the final settlement. They are important parameters in the Middle East peace process and must be observed and reaffirmed. Mr. President, the recent escalation of tension in Gaza Strip is quite unsettling. We urge relevant parties to exercise maximum restraint, refrain from any hostile actions that may further aggravate the fragile security situation. The Secretary General's call for global ceasefire should be heeded and truly followed. We also note with concern the increased demolitions of Palestinian-owned structures in the West Bank that lead to more and more displacement. Concrete efforts must be made to implement Security Council Resolution 2334, including ceasing all settlement activities, stopping demolitions, and preventing violence against the civilians. The international community should take a holistic approach and promote peace through development. We commend the UN agencies, including WHO and UNRWA, for lending a helping hand. We call for intensified international efforts to alleviate Palestine's economic and humanitarian difficulties, including through UNRWA. It's also imperative to end the blockade on the Gaza Strip and allow timely delivery of humanitarian assistance and services to people in need. Mr. President, China attaches great importance to the Iranian nuclear issue. We are committed to upholding multilateralism, safeguarding the international nuclear non-proliferation regime, and maintaining peace and stability in the Middle East. It must be pointed out that the JCPOA is now faced with severe challenges after the United States sent a letter to you to unilaterally and illegally demand for invoking a snapback mechanism. The U.S. is no longer a JCPOA participant. JCPOA participants and the overwhelming majority of Council members believe that U.S. demand for restoring UN sanctions on Iran has no legal ground and goes against the common views, and the snapback mechanism shall not be deemed as invoked. China resolutely opposes the U.S. demand and holds the view that the U.S. letter should not be identified as the notification specified in OP 11 of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. China urges you, Mr. President, not to take any action on the U.S. demand. The Council should fully respect the views of the international community and the overwhelming majority of Council members, uphold its credibility and authority, and fulfill its responsibility of maintaining international peace and security. We stand ready to work with other parties to push forward the political settlement of the Iranian nuclear issue. It's my strong wish, Mr. President, that you can inform the Council members what's your position on the U.S. letter and what's your plan to guide the discussion at the Security Council in this regard. And thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China for his statement. Now I would like to make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Indonesia. Dear colleagues, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by conveying my appreciation to Mr. Mladenov, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East process, for his insightful briefing. Excellencies, as the Council, we have regularly met to discuss the situation in Palestine. But for Indonesia, Palestine is never just a regular meeting. Constant suffering and pain of Palestinians caused by decades of illegal occupation, displacement, violence, conflict, and blockades are not things that you can treat as a regular matter. It is our solemn duty to find a solution and ensure that Palestinians achieve their inalienable right to self-determination, national independence and sovereignty, and the right of return. On that note, let me share 3 key points. First, the status of the annexation plan. Indonesia expresses its concern about the statement made by Israel, as instead of abandoning the annexation plan, it has merely suspended it. We need to be clear that any form of annexation, today or tomorrow, remains illegal. It is against international law and various UN resolutions, and a direct challenge to the Council and to the international order. The suspension does not add the root causes of the conflict. We need to remind ourselves that the creeping annexation and illegal occupation were going on long before Israel decided to formally annex the West Bank. Through its resolution of 2334 of 2016, the Council underlined inter alia that it will not recognize any changes to the 4th June 1967 lines, including with regard to Jerusalem, other than those agreed by the parties through negotiation. As such, we need to continue to reject the plan of annexation. I should like to remind the Security Council that the voice of concern and rejection of annexation has been expressed firmly from different corners of the world, including national parliaments, civil society, and the elders. Second, the human aspect of the conflict. Beyond the conflict, beyond the politics, the conflict has a profound effect on the people on the ground. Decades of illegal occupation, expanding settlement, and an increase in demolition and displacement have inflicted severe deterioration on the living condition of millions of Palestinians, especially women and children. In an informal briefing by Palestinian children, we directly heard of their fears and sorrows in their daily efforts to pursue education and lead a normal life. The drastic increase of confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the OPT for the past 2 months add a significant burden to the already severe condition of Palestinians in their quest to meet their basic needs. We need to strengthen our commitment in ensuring the needed humanitarian support, particularly through UNRWA, which continues to strive to fulfill the basic needs of Palestinians, including by providing school and health care. Third, the need to ensure a comprehensive solution. Suspension of the Israel annexation plan is merely a stopgap response. What we need and what the Palestinians really need is a comprehensive solution that is just and sustainable. Without addressing the root causes, we only prolong the suffering of millions of Palestinians, including its refugees. Indonesia therefore urges relevant parties to commit to a credible multilateral peace process based on internationally agreed parameters, including the two-state solution, to find a fair and sustainable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Excellencies, for Indonesia as a matter of principle, the settlement of the Palestinian question must be based on and fully respect all relevant UN resolutions and the internationally agreed parameters. All efforts and initiatives should be directed toward ensuring Palestinian rights and in implementing the two-state solution. We need to remain committed and stand united in our efforts against all illegal acts of the Israeli government toward ending the occupation and the conflict in the Middle East. I thank you. Now I would like to resume my function as President of the Council. There are questions posed to me. On the Russian Federation question, as well as others, having consulted with members and received letters from many member countries, it is clear for me that there is one member which has a particular position on the issues, while there are significant numbers of members who have contesting views. In my view, there is no consensus in the Council. Thus, the President is not in the position to take further action. Thank you. Now, I don't see any name inscribed on the list of speakers. We will now adjourn the meeting.
Franz would like to take the floor.
Franz would like to take the floor. Franz, you have the floor. And
thank you, Mr. President. With regard to the question you on and that was raised by the Russian ambassador regarding the letter sent by the United States on August 20th on Resolution 2231, I would like to recall the view expressed very clearly by the E3 in our letter circulated the same day, and I quote, "The United States is not a JCPOA participant state under UN Security Council Resolution 2231 anymore, and therefore do not consider that the United States notification is effective." End of quote. To say it more precisely, and I quote again, "The purported notification under OP 11 of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 is incapable of having legal effect and so cannot bring into effect the procedure foreseen under OP 11. End of quote. This procedure being the so-called snapback procedure. So we took note of the converging views expressed by 13 out of the 15 members of the Security Council on that matter. And as a consequence, we firmly believe that no further steps can take place within the Security Council. Let me also recall that as committed JCPOA participants, we, the E3, believe that we should continue to address the current issues arising from systematic Iranian non-compliance with its JCPOA commitments through continued dialogue between all remaining JCPOA participants, foremost within the Joint Commission and in the framework of discussions engaged under the dispute resolution mechanism. We welcome the fact that the Joint Commission will convene in Vienna on September 1st and enable us to directly address these issues. At the same time, we have serious concerns about the implications for regional security presented by the scheduled expiry of the UN conventional arms embargo, which were also raised by several countries from the region and other UN Security Council members. The E3 are willing to pursue work with Council members and JCPOA participants to seek a realistic path forward that could secure the support of the Council. As a reminder, France abstained on the US draft resolution on August 14th because it did not constitute an appropriate response to the challenges posed by the expiration of the embargo. The draft could not gather enough support and were therefore not likely to advance security and stability in the region. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. I see the United States asking for the floor. Kelly, you have the floor.
Thank you, Johnny. On August the 20th, the United States took the only reasonable and responsible action left to us. After the majority of this body surrendered to unthinkable inaction, abandoned the people of Iran and the Middle East, and invited an arms race that regional nations have begged to avoid. For months and months, we have told the Council that President Trump would never allow the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism to freely buy and sell planes, tanks, missiles, and other kinds of conventional weapons. The countries of the Middle East, most familiar with Iran's terror, pressed us to stay true to our commitment. We reminded members of our right under Resolution 2231 to trigger snapback, and our firm intent to do so in the absence of courage and moral clarity by the Council. It can be of no surprise that we have arrived here today. As Secretary Pompeo stated from UN grounds last week with absolute clarity, America won't join in this failure of leadership. America will not appease. America will lead. The leadership begins with recognizing the Islamic Republic of Iran for what it truly is, a theocratic, revolutionary, brutish regime that will not voluntarily seek peace or make life better for the Iranian people. Iran has defied this Council's arms embargo, fomenting conflict and murder throughout the world as it supplies weapons to proxy militias and terrorist groups. History is replete of tragedies of appeasing regimes such as this one that for decades have kept its own people under its thumb. However, there can be no mistaking where we are today. Put simply, it is Russia and China that revel in this Council's dysfunction and failure. It is Iran that celebrates its newfound leverage over the free nations of the world. It is Hezbollah that welcomes the possibility of new, more powerful weapons to fuel their campaign of terror. It is the Maduro regime that has already expressed glee at the prospect of additional Iranian support. It is the Houthi rebels who see new life to their already brutal assaults on the Yemeni people. It is our European colleagues on this Council that has expressed privately their concerns about lifting sanctions on Iran, but have taken no actions to address that concern. And let me just make it really, really clear. The Trump administration has no fear in standing in limited company on this matter in light of the unmistakable truth guiding our actions. I only regret that other members of this Council have lost their way and now find themselves standing in the company of terrorists. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany. Günther, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Mr. President, dear Johnny, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to exchange views on this important matter. I fully subscribe to the remarks that Anne has just made for the French Republic. We fully support the presidency's view. The purported notification by the United States is in legal terms null and void. As E3, we have explained our position in a letter to the President of the Security Council. The United States is no longer a JCPOA participant, and therefore the United States cannot activate the snapback mechanism. The status of the United States within OP10 of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231 changed when the United States ceased to be a JCPOA participant in 2018. Accordingly, we firmly hold that the purported notification under OP 11 of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231 is incapable of having legal effect and so cannot bring into effect the procedure foreseen under OP 11. It flows from this that any decision and action which would be taken based on this procedure or on its possible outcome would also be devoid of any legal effect. Let me add, we are firmly convinced that protecting the JCPOA is of crucial importance. The nuclear deal with Iran is not perfect, but it continues to be the international community's best tool to prevent a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. This is why we defend this agreement. This is why we continue to demand that Iran return to full compliance with this agreement. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Günther. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. Ambassador James, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Mr. President, and thank you for your brief update to the Council just now, with which the UK concurs. But I want to say a few other things. The first is that the UK remains resolutely committed to full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2231, through which the JCPOA was endorsed in 2015. This is in order to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, our priority. In order to preserve the JCPOA, Iran must return to nuclear compliance without delay. Along with our E3 partners, France and Germany, we urge Iran to engage urgently and constructively with the dispute resolution mechanism. As E3 foreign ministers set out in their statement on the 19th of June and the 20th of August, we do not support a move to snap back at this time, which would be incompatible with our current efforts to preserve the JCPOA. With regard to the question of my Russian colleague on the letter set out by the United States on the 20th of August, and your own summary, Mr. President, I would like to align with the position expressed by France and Germany. It is the UK's opinion that the United States ceased to be a participant to the JCPOA following their withdrawal from the deal on the 8th of May 2018. Our position regarding the effectiveness of the United States notification pursuant to Resolution 2231 has been very clearly explained to you, the Presidency, and all Council members. But I would like to make clear that we share the United States' concern about the expiry of the arms restrictions on Iran in October this year. As E3 foreign ministers have said, the expiry of the restrictions could have serious implications for regional security, given Iran's continued destabilization activities. The last UN Secretary-General report, which the Council discussed back in June, detailed how Iran has continued to violate Security Council Resolution 2231, Annex B, including through illicit arms transfers in the region, ballistic missile proliferation, and attacks on its neighbours. The United Kingdom will continue to enforce remaining restrictions rigorously, including on the proliferation of arms to non-state actors covered by other Security Council resolutions, ballistic missile restrictions under Annex B, and the EU-UK arms embargoes, which will remain in place until 2023. We continue to work with the remaining JCPOA participants and this Council to seek a path forward to address arms restriction expiry in October. Thank you, Mr. President.
Representative of the United Kingdom. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium, Ambassador Philippe. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me first express my appreciation for the efforts of the Indonesian presidency during these difficult times. Ambassador Jani, I want to assure you of the full support of my delegation to you and to your team. In line with our European Union partners, France and Germany, Belgium deeply regrets the present situation, which could pose a threat to the proper functioning, authority, and integrity of this Council. As already stated in the letter sent to you, Mr. President, Belgium does not recognize the legality of the purported notification by the United States of America. The US ceased its participation in the JCPOA on the 8th of May 2018, and therefore, it is no longer a JCPOA participant state. Belgium firmly supports the ongoing efforts by the remaining JCPOA participant states to address the issues of Iranian non-compliance with its JCPOA engagements within the framework of the dispute resolution mechanism. In the same vein, Belgium is of the view that the issue of the upcoming lifting of the conventional arms embargo should not jeopardize the nuclear agreement and its achievements. The JCPOA is crucial in order to effectively ensure the exclusively peaceful nature of the nuclear program of Iran. This is a top priority for the region, for international security, as well as for the global non-proliferation architecture. Mr. President, we must abide by the methods and decisions agreed upon by this body and by the international community, not undermine them. We must actively preserve the JCPOA as well as the non-proliferation regime. Let me express, therefore, the willingness of Belgium to engage constructively and work towards a solution along these lines. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci beaucoup. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Estonia. Estonia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we took note of the letter sent by the United States notifying the Security Council of a significant non-performance by Iran of its commitments under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. We also took note of the letters sent by other JCPOA participants who consider that the United States is no longer a JCPOA participant and therefore cannot initiate the snapback procedure. Considering that there is no agreement among the JCPOA initial participants regarding the US status as a JCPOA participant, we support the Security Council presidency to consider the notification as ineffective for the purposes of snapback. However, the Security Council needs to address the concerns regarding the planned lifting of the conventional arms embargo in October 2020. We agree with the United States and with our European partners that the expiry of the arms embargo would have potentially serious consequences for the region and its security. Iran's destabilizing and malicious activities in the Middle East have been reckless, irresponsible, and warrant the full attention of the Security Council. We are encouraged by the willingness of the JCPOA participants and other Security Council members to find a solution that will secure the support of this Council. I thank you very much.
For your statement. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Ambassador Ronda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we thank you for your update and assessment. Let me begin by saying St. Vincent and the Grenadines reaffirms its strong support for the JCPOA, and we reiterate that the agreement remains the only viable path to ensure a peaceful, comprehensive, and long-term solution to the Iranian nuclear issue. We wholeheartedly believe that a commitment to dialogue and negotiation will not only preserve the JCPOA, but will go a long way towards resolving the current issues. The preservation of the JCPOA is critical to safeguarding peace and stability in the region, and we once again urge all parties to commit fully to multilateralism and refrain from actions that are contradictory to the requirements and goals of Resolution 2231 and the JCPOA. We maintain the position outlined on 20th August 2020 joint letter of the A3 plus 1, Niger, South Africa, Tunisia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that states, and I quote, having confirmed its withdrawal from the JCPOA, I will begin from the beginning of the quote. Having confirmed its withdrawal from the JCPOA, and by not participating in any of the JCPOA structures or subsequent activities, the United States ceased to be a JCPOA participant and is, therefore, ineligible to submit a notification to the Security Council in terms of Resolution 2231. End of quote. And I thank you, Johnny, Mr. President.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa, Ambassador Jerry. Jerry, you have the floor.
Thank again, Mr. President, for giving me the floor once more. You are so generous. Mr. President, I took the floor to support the statement just made by Ambassador King of St. Vincent and Grenadines, quoting the letter jointly signed, agreed upon, and sent to you, President, by the A3+1, Niger, Tunisia, St. Vincent and Grenadines, and South Africa on the 20th of this month on the snapback issue. Mr. President, I just took the floor to once more to say we stand by that letter, but more so, Mr. President, we support the preservation of JCPOA. This JCPOA, Mr. President, was a carefully negotiated, balanced, and diplomatic process of over a decade. And therefore, its preservation is necessary. But also because we, as South Africa, we see JCPOA in its entirety as a contribution towards a nuclear-free Middle East and towards a zone of peace in the Middle East. Mr. President, you all recall that we as South Africa had to terminate our own nuclear program to contribute towards a nuclear-free Africa and create a zone of peace in our continent, free from production and deployment of nuclear weapons, and embarked on a peaceful use of nuclear technology. We are proud that Africa is a nuclear-free zone. We wish to see this, Mr. President, the Middle East, and we thought JCPOA is part of a contribution in that direction. We call all JCPOA members to preserve, those who are remaining, to preserve this agreement and its integrity. And we call upon them to fulfill their obligations under the JCPOA. Mr. President, a few days ago, we marked the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first ever nuclear bombing used in this planet. That's a few days ago. On behalf of Hibakushas and the survivors of that Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombing, we urge you to help us to create a nuclear-free world in our lifetime. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. Thank you very much, Jerry. Now on my list, I have the distinguished representative of Tunisia, Ambassador Kais. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and let me first reiterate our full support to the Indonesian presidency. Tunisia has already expressed its position on this issue in the joint letter of the A3+1 addressed to you on August 20. Having said that, I take this opportunity to reiterate our consistent position in supporting the full implementation of Resolution 2231 and the JCPOA, while reaffirming the importance of addressing the legitimate security concerns in the region. We believe that the collapse of the JCPOA would further exacerbate tension in the Middle East and put stability and security in the region under serious risks and may trigger nuclear race. We call on all parties to resume dialogue, to find solution, to resolve differences, and to refrain from any action that could erode trust and undermine the Security Council authority. My delegation remains ready to work with member states to foster an environment conducive to this dialogue and cooperation for peace, stability in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia. Thank you, Kais. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam. Ambassador Cui, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I ask for the floor to reassure our full support for your leadership, Mr. President. And as with the issues currently under discussion, our position is clearly expressed in the letter to the President of the Council. And here I would like to reiterate the following point. First, the United Nations Charter and international law shall be strictly adhered to. The correlation between the enjoyment of rights and fulfillment of obligation is fundamental in giving effect to international agreement. The JCPOA constitutes an integral part of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231. As such, the invocation of progresses and procedures under Resolution 2231 shall follow the implementation of the JCPOA. Vietnam's consistent position is to support the full implementation of Resolution 2231 and the JCPOA. We call on relevant parties to continue dialogue and negotiation to find solutions to resolve differences, including by using existing processes and procedures under Resolution 2231 and the JCPOA, and to exercise restraint and refrain from any action that could exacerbate the situation, erode trust, and escalate the tension. On our part, Vietnam is ready to work with the member states to foster an environment conducive to dialogue and cooperation within and beyond the United Nations Security Council for peace, stability, and development in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Cui. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of China, Ambassador Jun. Jun, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be very, very brief. Simply to say that China supports the conclusion you have made concerning the issue of JCPOA. That's really the right step towards the right direction. Meanwhile, I also wish to point out that China rejects the accusations made by the representative of the United States against China. Once again, they are trying to turn black white. And once again, I can assure you that their attempt will never succeed. Whatever the United States says, China is determined in defending multilateralism, in defending JCPOA, in defending the non-proliferation regime, and also in defending the peace and security in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. Thank you, Jun. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, Ambassador Vasily. Vasily, you have the floor. Vasily, we cannot hear you. Vasily.
Do you hear me now? Yeah, good. Thank you, Gianni. Our position on the matter is very well known. It has been expressed consistently on many occasions, and lastly in our communication to the President of the Security Council after US allegedly triggered a snapback, which we challenged. That communication has been circulated as a document of the Security Council. I will not be repeating it. Today's discussion clearly demonstrated where the Security Council members, most of them, stand on the issue. They all confirmed the paramount need to preserve the JCPOA, and the preservation of the JCPOA is important for the whole international community, including for the United States. And I hope that the United States would be able to finally realize it and not to pursue this path, which is not only illegal, but simply will not lead to achieving the result that was envisaged by the United States, and it will refrain from further steps to pursue this path. But my main point, Mr. President, was also to thank you for the conclusion that you made in response to our question. I think that's a prudent step that you are taking, given the positions of the member states of the Council on the matter that we raised. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Thank you, Vasily. Now I see there are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I will now adjourn the meeting so that the Council can continue its discussion on the agenda item of Middle East, including the Palestinian question, in closed format. The meeting is adjourned.